So today's video is going to be another solved true crime case. Today we're going back to the UK for a very, very requested case on my channel, and I don't often cover cases involving children. I used to quite a bit, but then they started really quite affecting me. So I tend to do more adult cases now. But this one really stood out to me for some reason and I really wanted to cover it. So today we're going to be talking about the death of Damilola Taylor. But before we get into it, I just want to thank our sponsors for making this video possible, NordVPN. NordVPN is a virtual private networking service that allows you to appear as though you're working from a different IP address, somewhere else in the world. Reasons that you might want a VPN include being able to access regional locked content, so YouTube videos that are locked in your country. Use a VPN, put yourself in a different country, you can access that video. Other countries have different Netflix selections. I've heard that the UK actually has the best Disney Plus selection. Don't quote me on that, but I've heard it. So if you're into Disney Plus. And I heard that the US have the best Netflix selection, so that's what I use it for personally. But the main reason that I personally use a VPN is for safety and security. The VPN acts as a barrier between you and all your information and people on the outside that might be trying to hack it and access your information. VPNs are essential for me when I'm using public Wi-Fi, so like cafes, libraries. I often work on trains to and from places, and you never know how secure those Wi-Fi connections are, so I like to use a VPN to keep myself protected. And right now, NordVPN are offering you guys 68% off of your subscription, making it just $3.71 a month, plus a full month free if you go through my link, which is nordvpn.com/Eleanor, and use my code Eleanor at checkout. Thanks again to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. Now, I just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes, and everything I'm about to say is just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. Just a warning before we get into this case, like I said in the beginning, it does involve the death of a child. So if that is something that you don't want to watch, you can't watch, feel free to click out and I'll see you in another video. Damilola Taylor was born on December 7th, 1989 in Lagos, Nigeria, to parents Richard and Gloria Taylor. He had an older sister named Bemi and an older brother named Tunde, and they were pretty much like a decade older than him. His mother wanted another son for a long time, but she just couldn't fall pregnant until finally Damilola came. So he was the baby of the family. His older siblings were pretty much growing up, going to uni and everything when he was still in school. And Damilola was the smiley one. He was the confident one. He was the very outgoing one. He was always performing. He was an entertainer. He was known for having that kind of always happy, always positive, even like contagious positivity. Like you saw Damilola smiling and it made you smile. He was a very lovable little boy. His father said that he related very well to like the elderly and the adults, people much, much older than him, because he had one of those older than they actually are kind of spirits. Does that make sense? You know those kids that you come across and you're like, oh my god, that's an old person stuck in a child's body. Like just the way that they act and they talk, they're just like a little old person. And that's what Damilola was like. He could sit and have full conversations with the adults like he was an adult himself. For the first few years of his life, Damilola and his family lived in a city named Ketu in Lagos, and he attended the Wisdom Montessori school in a town named Ikosi. And the family had a really good life in Nigeria. Richard Taylor, the father, had a job as a civil servant, which was very well paying. The children went to good schools. It was good for this family. However, in the year 2000, Damilola's older sister Bemi started suffering very badly with epilepsy. This was something that she'd suffered with for a while, but it was getting so bad and she needed very serious treatment in order to save her life, pretty much. However, the treatment that Bemi required wasn't offered in Nigeria, or at least it was very expensive in Nigeria. I don't know the exact circumstances, but Bemi was actually born in the UK. So the Taylor family, when Richard and Gloria first kind of married and started having children, they had Bemi and Tunde in London, in England. And so Bemi actually qualified for treatment on the NHS. She was a UK citizen. And so that meant that she could get this life-saving epilepsy treatment for free over in London. And so the family made the very big and hard decision to move half of the family from Nigeria to London. Richard Taylor couldn't leave his job over in Nigeria. It was a very important job. It was something that he couldn't just pick up and take to the UK. But it was urgent. They couldn't wait for Richard to kind of find a time that was suitable. This treatment couldn't wait. And so Gloria Taylor, originally she was just going to take Bemi and Tunde, but Damilola really wanted to go. His father Richard was reluctant to let Damilola go with them because he was 10 years old at this point and he'd just started school. He was setting the groundwork of his life. He was making friends. He was growing up. He'd settled in really well. And Richard just thought that taking him over to London, picking him out of his life that he'd established and just throwing him into a different country just wasn't ideal. But Damilola really wanted to go. He wanted to be with his mother, with his brother and sister. But finally, after much pleading, Richard Taylor finally let Damilola go to London with his mother, his brother and his sister. The four of them moved in with a family member that they had over in London on the North Peckham estate in Peckham, South London. And Peckham was, and I think still is, a very poverty-stricken area. It's not a nice area. But this also meant that housing was cheap, and that's exactly what they needed. For 4 people, a single parent family, kind of technically, one parent was in a different country, they needed relatively cheap housing, especially since Gloria couldn't really work because she had to be taking Bemi to all of her treatments. The only income that they had was from Richard back over in Nigeria, and then Tunde got a part-time job, but they couldn't afford anything more than a flat. But little did they know the issues that come with living in a place like this. The crime rates were very, very high. Unemployment rates, very high. It's generally just quite a dangerous area, is Peckham, and it was then, even more so back then actually. It was just a huge step down from what the family were used to in Nigeria when they had the good life and the high income. This was a total shock for them. So anyway, the family settled down in this family member's flat for the time being. They were all kind of sleeping in the living room on the sofa and on the floor, but they needed to be there. Tunde went and got a part-time job along with his university studies. He was in university, and Bemi started her treatment. Damilola started school. They were settling in. And it was around this time that Damilola actually decided that he wanted to become a doctor when he was older, because he wanted to be able to find a cure for epilepsy so that people that had what his sister Bemi had wouldn't have to suffer the way that she had. So Damilola started school and he fit in pretty well. He played football with the other boys and he was a really good goalie, and so the boys always wanted him on their team. You know, he was always picked to play football at break times because he was good at it. He was really into football, was Damilola, not just playing it but also watching it. He supported Manchester United Football Club, sometimes Liverpool, and he actually bought his first pair of football boots within his first few weeks of being over in the UK. And Damilola just overall loved his school. He loved his new friends. He really liked UK schools. So obviously there's a huge difference between schools in every single different country. But in Nigerian schools at the time, they didn't have laptops. They didn't have a lot of the technology that we have or had at that time in UK schools, and he loved that there were laptops in the school, and he was just having a lot of fun. On the phone to his father, he told him that he was on track to become a prefect one day, and he begged his father not to bring him back to Nigeria because they kind of came to this agreement that he was going to be in London for 3 months, and then after that 3 months he was going to go back to Nigeria and continue his schooling back over there. But he wanted to stay. He loved his UK school. He loved his friends. He was very interested and very invested in his education and his future. He wanted to secure a good career for himself. And even at 10 years old, he was thinking about what he could do to get the best life for himself, the best career for himself when he was older. He would do his homework as soon as he got home. He would go to the library after school to do more work, which of course, his parents were over the moon with. They were really proud of Damilola, but that also made him a target for bullies sometimes, who saw this kind of behaviour as like geeky and like he was a suck-up to the teachers. It was sparked in November of the year 2000. Damilola had been in London for about 2 months, just over 2 months at this point, and it was when he began going to Peckham Library after school on his way home. And on his way home from the library, because he used to walk home from the library from school every single day, he would be targeted by older kids that just hung about on the streets. And it was the winter time, so it was probably dark, or at least dropping dark, as Damilola was making his way home. And I can't imagine how intimidating that must have been for a 10-year-old boy to have older kids in a country that you're not entirely familiar with yet as well. Older kids flocking round you and intimidating you as you're walking home every single day. It started off with verbal abuse from these older boys, and it wasn't a specific group of older boys. There were a lot of different boys that would do this to him, just older boys from this other school. They would target the younger ones from their rival school. And the verbal abuse started out mainly racial. They would mock his Nigerian accent. They would call him gay. And bear in mind, this is a 10-year-old child, a 10-year-old boy minding his own business, innocently just walking home. And he was very naive and very shy as well, was Damilola. He didn't try to defend himself. He didn't talk back. He just didn't look and just walked away. And like I said, they were from this rival school. So there were 2 primary schools in the area, and Damilola went to one which was mainly minorities, and then the other primary school was mainly white. And so the older kids from this white school would hang around and wait for the other kids from the other school to come out, and they would target the younger ones. They would mug them, they would steal things from them, bully them. And kids at that age, they don't even really have anything on them. They would steal phones if they had them, but bear in mind this was the year 2000. Young children didn't really have phones, so they would steal things like money if they had a couple of coins on them to go and get something on the way home. They would steal Pokemon cards, coats, anything. On November the 26th of 2000, Damilola went home and told his mother Gloria about this abuse that he had been facing on the way home every single day. And rightly so, she was very concerned. She wanted to know those boys' names. She wanted to know what school they went to. She wanted to go speak to them. But Damilola wouldn't let her. He wouldn't tell her names. He wouldn't tell her pretty much anything out of fear that her getting involved could make it worse. And so all Gloria could really do was try to protect her baby. And so on November 27th, the following morning, she walked him all the way to school. Now, it was normally Tunde that would walk him to and from school, but now he had a part-time job. He was in university. He couldn't do it every single time, so Gloria took him this time. And while she promised Damilola that she wouldn't say anything, after he'd gone into the school, Gloria went and spoke to his head teacher and just told him the situation and told him to keep an eye on Damilola. Although what Gloria didn't know was that this was going on outside of school. That same day, on the 27th, Damilola went to school, everything was good, and then when he finished school, he went to Peckham Library, as normal. He left the library around 4:50 p.m. to walk home. Here we see him leaving the library, he's jumping on benches, he's playing, he's happy. But within an hour of these CCTV clips, Damilola Taylor would be murdered before he even reached his home. When he didn't arrive home at the usual time that night, his mother Gloria began panicking. Of course, after what she heard the night before, she was really worried. What had these bullies done to her son? So she went out, she was really panicked. She was running the streets, retracing Damilola's route home that night, seeing if she could see him along the way. She was asking different people, his teachers, people at the library, anyone. But no one had heard or seen from Damilola, and she was almost home at this point. She'd almost done the full route and still no sign of him. However, when she was just a few streets away from her own, on Blake's Road, she was met with police cars, ambulances, and a whole crime scene taped off. So she ran up and spoke with the police officers that were stood at this crime scene tape, and they told her that a young boy had been attacked. And Gloria knew that this was her son. It had to have been. So now the following story that I'm about to tell you is police's theorised version of events. It's believed that Damilola set off from Peckham Library and he pretty much got all the way home, almost, completely safely. That was until he got about 400 yards away from his own housing estate, when he was stopped by some boys. This group of boys swarmed him, giving him the usual kind of verbal abuse, and it's believed that they were trying to mug him. They were trying to steal something from him. But Damilola didn't have anything, and he wasn't the type to give up so easy. He wasn't going to give anything over to these boys. Police believe in particular that they were trying to steal Damilola's silver coat that his mother had just bought him because it was starting to get cold in the UK. And this bright silver coat was what attracted these boys to Damilola. And when he refused to hand it over, these boys got violent. It's unknown exactly what happened to Damilola in those few minutes. We don't know what the kids were saying to him, what they were doing to him, but we know that it did end with one of these boys grabbing a smashed bottle from the ground and stabbing 10-year-old Damilola in the leg with it before they all fled. And this stab wound was very severe. It was right in his femoral artery, and the boy that had done it had twisted it slightly inside his leg. So this was a very big wound. It was a 6 centimeter S-shaped wound, and he was losing a lot of blood from it very quickly. It wasn't enough to render him completely immobile. He could still walk. It was like a stagger, but he could still move. However, if it wasn't seen to immediately, this wound would be fatal. And I think Damilola knew that. He knew that this was very serious. He must have been in a lot of pain. However, being the brave boy that he was, he got up and began staggering over to the nearest estate that he could to try to make his way home. He managed to pull himself to the opening of an outdoor stairwell, which was on an estate that was quite a while away from his own. It was going to be a long journey for him to try to make, especially when he was bleeding this much. But nevertheless, 10-year-old Damilola begins walking up these stairs, and he must have been in so much pain, and as he's getting higher and higher up this stairwell, he's getting more and more exhausted, until when he was almost at the top, he collapses. Meanwhile, as this was going on, a man that lived on this estate had been walking back home, and he'd walked past the entrance of the stairwell that Damilola had gone up, and he noticed that there was a trail of blood leading up these stairs. And this was a lot of blood. It wasn't a couple of drops, this was a lot, and this man knew that whoever had bled that much needed immediate help, and so he followed the trail of blood all the way up this stairwell until he found Damilola almost unconscious on the floor. So this man ran over to Damilola, he grabbed him, scooped him up in his arms, and he was checking him over, trying to figure out where he was bleeding from. And that was when Damilola looked up at him, tried to smile, and muttered what would be his last words: "I'm okay." This man phoned the emergency services to try to get Damilola both police and an ambulance, and he said, "There's a boy bleeding to death. He's actually bleeding to death. This boy is approximately 12 years of age. He's lost a hell of a lot of blood." And as this man was on the phone to the operator, Damilola was fading in and out of consciousness, and this man knew that he didn't have long left. And he said to the operator, "He's going." By this point, a few other people had congregated in this stairwell because this man had been shouting for help, and so there were about 5 people around Damilola at this point trying to stop the bleeding, or at least slow it a little bit. When paramedics arrived, they did all they possibly could at the scene. However, at this point, Damilola's leg had stopped bleeding, meaning that his heart had stopped beating. It had stopped pumping blood around his body. Sadly, it was too late. Damilola was pronounced dead at the hospital just after 5:30. It's believed that he passed away in that concrete stairwell before paramedics even arrived. And all of this was going on just 10 days before his 11th birthday. His family have said that a silver lining in this was knowing that Damilola wasn't alone. Even though he was in the company of strangers, those strangers said that they were friends with him in that last few minutes that he had on this earth. Meanwhile, all of his family are in the waiting room at the hospital, waiting to hear what had happened to Damilola. And Tunde knows that he needs to contact Richard Taylor, his father, back in Nigeria, and so he calls him on a payphone. And Richard was actually in a meeting at the time when the phone call came through. It came through to the head office, which he thought was unusual. Why was his family calling the head office and not his personal office? However, they said that it was urgent. And so Richard came out of this meeting and found out that his 10-year-old son had been murdered. He said that once he heard those words that Damilola had gone, everything was just a blur for him. He collapsed and later woke up in the medical centre being treated. After that, he made his way to the UK as quickly as he possibly could. He got the next flight he was allowed out of Nigeria. However, he was followed the whole entire way by paparazzi and news reporters. They couldn't just give this man, this grieving man that found out his 10-year-old son had been murdered, they couldn't even give him a little bit of space. Although there was a lot of sympathy for the Taylors, because I think a lot of families could relate to this. This was a 10-year-old boy that was bullied. A lot of children do go through bullying and parents feel really helpless, and everyone thought, well, what if that was my son, you know? It's every parent's worst nightmare that something like this could ever happen to their child, and a lot of news reporters and presenters, people that were interviewed surrounding this case, all said that it felt as though they lost a child. The whole of the UK lost a child that day. And it was the way that he passed as well, the way that he fought right up until that last minute, even telling the man that found him that he was okay. He tried to smile through it. He passed away in this cold concrete stairwell in a stranger's arms. Of course, the news and the media were bound to report very heavily on this case. This was an innocent child, an innocent 10-year-old that had been murdered on the streets of London and left for dead. This was a huge story. However, the UK media, the UK press are never sensitive, they're never respectful, they never understand that the grieving family don't want to be interviewed. They followed the family around like flies for the first few weeks of this, and Richard Taylor especially, he just couldn't deal with it, and eventually he had to refuse interviews, he had to refuse the press coming to certain places, and he ended up actually having to go back to Nigeria. He didn't want to, he wanted to stay in the UK with his son, his daughter, his wife. Of course, they still needed to be over there for the treatment, but he just couldn't. He couldn't handle the media and the constant reporters. However, before he left to go back to Nigeria, the police reassured him that they were going to do absolutely everything in their power to find out who did this to Damilola and get him some justice. Over 60 investigators were assigned to this case, which is one of the biggest police murder investigations that they'd had in years. They started by tracing Damilola's steps on CCTV. Of course, they got him on the CCTV at the library. They saw him in there. He was fine. He was in the lift. And then when he leaves the library, he's running around outside. He's playing with some friends. The last two people to see and speak with Damilola on that day before he set off home were his friend John and John's older sister, Grace. And they were the ones that he was playing with outside. They were playing tag outside the library. Everything was good. And his friend John is actually John Boyega from the Star Wars films. He was friends with Damilola when he was 11 years old, and he helped Damilola kind of integrate into London life a little bit more. He went to the same school as him, and he was like his closest friend when he first got there. Anyway, on these CCTV clips, he's having fun, everything is normal, and then John and Grace say goodbye to him and they set off on their separate ways to both go home. Unfortunately, Damilola's route home didn't have cameras all the way, and so they lose him on his route home. However, from what they could see, from the little bit of cameras that they did have, they didn't see anyone following him, anyone stalking him, anyone that seemed suspicious on these cameras. So they had no suspects yet at this point in the investigation. And so manual police work was going to be the biggest help here. Police literally going out onto the streets, looking around the area that Damilola was killed, trying to find any evidence, any clues, anything that was ditched, maybe a weapon. And that was when police found the broken shards of glass from that bottle that was used to stab Damilola, and it had Damilola's blood on it, so they knew that that was the weapon. DNA testing was still in its infancy at the time. They did run the glass shards through the system to see if any DNA popped up, but nothing did. And if Damilola's killer was another young person like it was suspected they were, his mother, of course, told the police about the bullying, and so that was the most believed theory at this point. If the killer was another young person, their DNA likely wasn't in the database yet, so that murder weapon was going to come in handy later on. If they ever got a suspect, they could then test the suspect against the murder weapon. Police also did a lot of door-to-door inquiries, going and knocking on people's doors and asking them if they'd seen or heard anything that night. They were also asking people if they knew of anyone that could have done this, anyone that was capable of this, had been violent in the past, you know. They were essentially just asking people to dob someone in. And that wasn't really going to work because people were not willing to cooperate with police. At this point, tensions were very high between the UK police and, well, everyone really, but mainly minorities in the UK. This murder took place the following year after Stephen Lawrence's murder inquiry. So not his actual murder, but Stephen Lawrence was another black teenager that was stabbed and killed in the streets of London. It was another racially motivated knife crime attack, which is, you know, seen quite often in London and not often dealt with very well. Black communities and minority communities in general didn't feel like the police were on their side, ever. They didn't feel like police were doing enough for them to solve these cases. They felt like the police were institutionally racist. I've actually done a video on the murder of Stephen Lawrence. I'll link it up here in the iCard if you haven't seen it and you want to. But that case caused a lot of tension between minorities and the police, and it was still very much in full swing at this point, and so people weren't willing to talk to police. Even though it would help in this case if people were open and honest, people didn't want to. A lot of people would open the door to these officers and just slam the door straight back in their face. They didn't want to even see them. But it wasn't just because people didn't like the police, you know, that was a big factor in this. But it was also because this was in Peckham, which is a very high crime rate area. There was a lot of crime going on there, and you know, if you open a door to a police officer and you know that you have committed a lot of crimes, you're going to want to get them away as fast as you can. You don't want to be friends with a police officer. You don't want to just sit and talk to them, just in case they kind of suspect you of something. So a lot of people just weren't willing to look their way. And I suppose there was the general fear that maybe this was like gang related. Because it was a 10-year-old, it didn't seem like it was a personal dispute. It seemed as though it was a random person that saw this 10-year-old and saw him as an easy target. And so people were worried that if they said anything, if they kind of gave police any form of evidence, maybe they heard or saw something that night, they were scared that they would be targeted next. But they thought that these people were staying silent either out of fear or even out of loyalty for their friend. They didn't want to dob their friend in. And so police really played on that. In a bid to try to get these young people to come forward about something, they decided to get a lot of influential people that they knew these young people would look up to. People like footballers, actors, you know, big celebrities, to come and give public appeals saying, if you know something relating to Damilola's murder, come forward, come and tell police. And they also put up a £50,000 reward in an attempt to kind of encourage those people to come forward as well. Meanwhile, police knew that they had to up the security in Peckham because whoever had done this to Damilola, if they could do it to a 10-year-old, an innocent 10-year-old, they could do it to anyone, and they were still out there. So police were stationed on every single estate in Peckham, just on patrol. They were walking around the area, both for protection and also to see if anything suspicious happened. And while I feel that this was a necessary action to take because they didn't know who had done this to Damilola, and it was potentially still dangerous for the public to be out in Peckham, they couldn't let this incident repeat itself. However, putting police out on these estates actually worked against them. With these really high tensions between the public and the police, people would leave their flats in Peckham and be like, oh, there's the police again. People felt like they were under constant surveillance. People felt like they were being watched by police and they didn't like it. They felt that there would be a lot better uses of police time and money than police just being stood in an estate car park. So around this time in the case, police announced that they were looking to speak with 3 black youths that had been seen on the night of Damilola's murder around that stairwell where he was killed. Police believed that these 3 kids were aged between 11 and 15. They were all wearing big, dark hoodies, and one report even said that they'd been seen running away from the scene. Some sources say that the man that actually found Damilola and called the emergency services, some sources say that he looked out of the window of this concrete stairwell and saw these 3 youths outside, and one of them even did a stabbing motion on his thigh. Now, I don't know if that is true because I don't think there were any windows near where Damilola was found, but I thought it was interesting to add anyway. Over the next few weeks, police arrested and then released 11 different people of interest. They were doing everything that they could to find a suspect with solid evidence behind it, but it was proving very hard. It was proving very, very hard to find this solid evidence. That's why they had to let these people go. Most of these people that were arrested were young boys that were from Peckham, from very close to where the murder happened. Maybe they were seen in Peckham that night. One of these boys that was arrested was actually very violent with police when he was like headbutting them and saying, "What are you going to do about that?" There was a mother of one of these boys that was arrested as well, just in case she was part of this. However, like I said, all of them were let free. And that doesn't mean that police were done with them, with these 11 people. That just meant that they didn't have the evidence right then to be able to charge them. So they weren't ruling these people out. They were just kind of letting them go for now. Finally, in the spring of 2001, so a good 4-5 months after the murder of Damilola, a 14-year-old girl came forward to police and said she witnessed the murder. However, she'd been too scared to come forward this whole time. She said it was 4 boys. She knew the 3 older ones and she knew of the 4th one, who was the youngest one, but she'd never spoken to him. And so for that reason, she could give police 4 names. And from this young girl's statement, 4 boys between the ages of 11 and 16 were all arrested and charged with Damilola's murder. On the 30th of January 2002, the trial began, and these 4 boys were not taking this seriously at all. One of them was yawning through the whole court proceeding. One of them brought a puzzle book, a little colouring in book. That's how young he was. They were described as behaving as though they were on a school trip, not on trial for murder. And this trial really just didn't go the way that police had hoped, because after all, their only kind of big piece of evidence was the witness statement of a 14-year-old girl. But eyewitness testimonies as a concept in themselves are just flawed. It's a flawed piece of evidence because the human brain tries to fill in gaps. If you forget something or if you didn't see something, your brain will fill in the gap and make you believe that that's what you saw. So you could be telling a story from your memory and you could believe it 100%. But that might not be how it happened. Especially over time. Now, this trial happened in 2002 and Damilola was killed at the end of 2000. So that's a lot of time for this girl's brain to be doing this, recreating the story. And people's memory is often not good enough to charge someone and sentence someone to a long prison sentence for murder. But on top of that, the defense argued, so the boys' side, argued that this girl came from a poor family. She didn't have much money. Maybe she'd only given these 4 boys' names forward in an attempt to get the reward money. In the time that she'd given police the names, so it had been nearly a year since she first got in touch with police and told them this story. In that year, they'd bought her clothes because she didn't have many. They'd bought her a mobile phone to keep in contact with them. And, this girl was seeing some kind of reward. She wouldn't get the £50,000 until she turned 18 if, this did go ahead. But she was seeing some kind of reward for this. And so the defense argued that this was inducement. She was being subconsciously or consciously bribed into giving this information against these boys, whether it's true or not. She was doing it for the money. She wasn't doing it because it was true. And it was also found that in general, she just wasn't a very reliable witness. She'd changed parts of her story here and there. She even admitted to police that she lied. She initially said that she'd seen the boys with Damilola, but then when she ran to follow them, they'd all gone their separate ways and Damilola had already gone up the stairs. However, police allegedly told her that if she'd seen the murder take place, like actually seen one of the boys stab Damilola, she would be more likely to get the reward money. And so she changed her story. Suddenly she saw the stabbing happen. So, she lied in court. The defense is saying that she did this for money motives. And then she was also just really rude in court. She was getting really defensive. She was shouting. She said that she didn't like the way that the defense were talking to her, like she was a little girl. And eventually, at one point, she even just got up and stormed out before finally calmly returning. But this just showed her immaturity. And she wasn't actually there to help solve this murder. She was there for her own personal gain. So finally, the judge ruled that this girl was an unreliable witness. She'd lied in court, and he acquitted all 4 boys of their murder charges, and they were let free. But police and Damilola's family weren't going to give up so easy. They were going to continue until they found even more concrete evidence to get someone sentenced and charged for Damilola's murder. Whether it was these boys or, completely other people, it depended what the evidence said. They were just waiting for that golden nugget piece of evidence. Damilola's case was given to a new leader at this point, and he decided that under his leadership, he was going to do everything again. Everything was going to be refreshed. So all the evidence pieces, everything, all DNA tested again. He was going to go through all the leads that police had ever had and make sure that they'd searched every single one of those leads to the absolute extent. And that was when they found 3 boys that they had a lead on previously, but just hadn't investigated it well enough. And so they went back to these 3 boys. They were now 16, 17, and 19 years old, but at the time of Damilola's murder, they were 12, 13, and 15. And in 2005, these 3 boys were arrested. They were all actually initially arrested as part of that first 11. I said they arrested 11 people and let them all go because they just didn't have evidence on them. These 3 boys were 3 of those 11. The 2 younger boys that were arrested, the ones that were 12 and 13 at the time, now 16 and 17, their names couldn't be given to the media because they were minors still, but they're not anymore. So the younger one was named Danny Preddy and the older one was named Ricky Preddy. Danny was 12, Ricky was 13. And the older one that was named the whole time because he was 19 when police arrested him, 15 at the time of the murder, he was named Hassan Jihad. And all 3 of them were now in police custody while police ran around trying to gather all the evidence and get that solid golden nugget piece of evidence against these boys. So like I said, this new leader had sent all of the DNA stuff to be tested, and now that they had 3 suspects, they could take these 3 boys' DNA and test it against the murder weapon and other things found at the scene. On top of that, they also went through these 3 boys' wardrobes, they went through all of their belongings and found clothing similar to what the 3 boys at the scene were described as wearing. So those big dark hoodies, they took everything that matched that description in these 3 boys' wardrobes and tested those as well. And these tests brought back a whole load of evidence. Not only was Damilola's blood on Danny Preddy's shoes, it was also on Ricky Preddy's sweatshirt. And there was also a lot of fibre exchange between the boys, so there were fibres from Damilola's clothes found on the 3 boys' clothes, and fibres from the 3 boys' clothes found on Damilola's clothes. So that showed that there'd been some contact. They'd touched Damilola that night. And of course, the blood on the Preddy brothers' clothing shows that they'd been near him when he was bleeding. And so for that reason, these 3 boys could be arrested on suspicion of Damilola's murder. They knew all 3 of them had something to do with it. They don't know which one actually stabbed Damilola, but they were all there, so they were all arrested. The trial was set for 2006, where all 3 boys pled not guilty. And Ricky Preddy, the older of the Preddy brothers, actually took a note to court with him that day, and on it he wrote "Real Justice" for Damilola Taylor, spelling Damilola's name incorrectly as well. So the boys' defense teams, they knew that they couldn't get the boys off scot-free here. It was clear that this blood exchange and the fibre exchange. They were guilty of something. They were going to go to prison, but it was just how much prison time they got. So instead, the defence team tried to argue that the boys hadn't stabbed Damilola, but they had been in a physical fight and pushed Damilola, and he'd fallen onto this glass bottle that was on the floor, and that was how he got the injury. He wasn't stabbed, he fell onto the shard of glass. So their approach was, yes, the boys did it, but it wasn't intentional. So that is a manslaughter plea. And it was a tricky one because that could have happened. It couldn't be proven either way. They couldn't prove that these boys picked up this shard of glass and stabbed Damilola with it. It was perfectly reasonable that he could have fallen on the glass. And a pathologist actually looked at his injury and said, well, yeah, he could have got it by falling on a shard of glass. And so for that reason, Hassan Jihad, the oldest of the three boys, was actually cleared of all of his charges because there was just fibre exchange. There was no blood on him. And the Preddy brothers, the two younger ones, 12 and 13 at the time, they were acquitted of a murder charge, but they were brought back for a different charge. Now the courts had to decide whether the Preddy brothers were guilty of manslaughter because Damilola did still die at their hands. You know, it was their fault. They were fighting with him and Damilola died. But was there premeditation here? Well, not so much premeditation, but intention. Did they pick up that glass and stab Damilola intending to hurt him, or did they push him and he fell and there wasn't intention to stab at all? Let me just interject here and say that no one believes that this was a fight. You know, in the court they have to look at all sides of this and they have to say, well, we can't prove that you actually stabbed them, but everyone believes that they did. But now the boys were tried for manslaughter and they were found guilty of that. And so they were both sentenced to 8 years each for killing this 10-year-old innocent little boy. And the reason that the sentences were so low for the Preddy brothers is because they were so young at the time that they did this. They were just 12 and 13 years old. And there was also the fact that this attack was very in the moment. The boys hadn't taken out a weapon with them that day with intention to cause horrific harm to another person. The weapon was found at the scene, so that always lowers the charge because it seemed like it was in the moment, they picked up the weapon, they used it without thinking. They didn't bring out a weapon intending to do this to someone. Ricky served just 5 years of his 8-year sentence, and Danny served just over 5 years of his. And then the two of them were released back out into the world in their early 20s with the rest of their lives ahead of them when they stole that from Damilola Taylor. Ricky Preddy has since reoffended. He's been in and out of jail ever since he got out for this, mostly for breaking the terms of his release, so he was ordered that he was never allowed to go back to Peckham. He was arrested on a number of charges, including GBH, dangerous driving, driving while disqualified, failing to stop, driving without insurance, and he also used the car to try to hit a female police officer. And for all of that, he was given 4 years. After their son's passing, Richard and Gloria Taylor opened the Damilola Taylor Fund and the Damilola Taylor Centre in London. And this charity, the main aim of this charity is to prevent and stop knife crime in London and nationwide. Richard Taylor believes that people that commit knife crimes are, in a way, victims themselves, victims of a bad upbringing, victims of poverty, victims of being influenced by all these bad influences around them. He believes that people's upbringings very much affect how they turn out, and they're a victim of their bad upbringing. And it's not their fault that they grow up to commit knife crimes. That's just, they were kind of destined to do that when they were born, and Richard wants to kind of interject into those people's lives that were born into these really bad environments and teach them that knife crime is not the answer. It's not what you have to do. And the Damilola Taylor Trust helps these young people that were born into these really quite bad environments. It helps them pick a career. It helps them play sport. It helps them have other focuses, other hobbies outside of the streets. It gives them something to do, something to focus on, something to work on in themselves, something more positive. Knife crime and, crime in general will always be a major thing in London. However, Richard Taylor believes that if you get in there early and change these people's lives and give them something better to live for, then maybe those numbers will start to drop over the years. On top of that, the government is also trying to tackle the high crime rates and high unemployment rates in Peckham. They're not doing it very well, but they're trying. This included tearing down all the main estates in Peckham and rebuilding them because they were major hotspots for crime and unemployment and just general dangerous places to be. They were rebuilt with a lot more enrichment in them, a lot more kind of grassy areas for youths to go out and play sport on and, you know, different things, not just big concrete estate blocks. They also added security guards to different estates, as well as just little things like better lighting on these estates that just make them a better and more comfortable place to live, especially because a lot of crime seems to happen at night or in dark places. Having these lights on makes people feel a lot safer when they're walking around the estates. More after school clubs have been opened, and especially the Damilola Taylor Trust opened the Damilola Taylor Centre, like I said. And there they do a lot of sports, they do a lot of kind of career enrichment, a lot of just anything to help young people develop their skills, major skills that they might use to get a job one day. But that is all I have on this case. Thank you so much for watching. The link to donate to the Damilola Taylor Trust will be down in the description if you want to go and donate. I think it's a really nice use of your money if you have anything spare. But that is all I have on this case. Thank you so much again to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. If you want to get 68% off of your subscription, making it just $3.71 a month plus an extra month free, make sure you're going through my link, which is nordvpn.com/Eleanor, and use my code Eleanor at checkout. Just a reminder that my merch is still up right now. Everything is on screen right now. We've got everything in pink, blue, and black. Hoodies, long sleeves, phone cases, masks. We even have socks now, mugs. So yeah, if you do want to pick something up, I would really appreciate it. The link is eleanorneale.shop. Let me know what you pick up. Send me your pictures in it. I really want to see. Huge thank you to all of my channel members for helping me decide the cases that I cover, especially my tier 2 members whose names are all on screen right now. If you want to become a channel member, you can just click the join button on a desktop, or there'll be a link in the description of this video. But yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, make sure you leave a big thumbs up because that really helps me out. If you want to subscribe, you can click right here. If you want to subscribe to my second channel, you can click right here. And if you want to watch another video from me, there'll be a playlist on screen right here. Bye!